Well, we're all here now. Welcome. Rizwaan's had to drive all the way from Liverpool, so it's not surprising that he didn't get here quite fine. Welcome, everyone. This is the fourth in our series of 4 seminars on Prevent, under the auspices of the Wadham Human Rights Forum, the Department of Politics and International Relations, and the London Review of Books. And this event is going to be a round table. We've got a very distinguished panel, and I'm going to ask, co-chaired by me and Karma, but our distinguished guest speakers are going to each speak for about 20 minutes, which will take us to around 6 o'clock, and then we're going to have an open discussion. I'm just going to introduce myself and then everyone else, for those of you who haven't been to these events before. My name is Ken Macdonald. I'm the warden of Wadham College. In a previous life, before I came to Oxford, I was Director of Public Prosecutions. In 2005, I established the counter-terrorism division, which was a specialist group of senior prosecutors who were focused exclusively on counter-terror cases. And in 2011, I oversaw the coalition government's review of counter-terrorism powers, which was published, I think, in 2012. My co-chair, Professor Nabulsi, is a distinguished academic at the University of Oxford. She studied for her MPhil and her DPhil at Balliol College, and in 2005 was elected to a tutorial fellowship at St Edmund Hall. She's a former Open Prize Research Fellow at Nuffield College, and her books include Traitors of War, Occupation, Resistance, and the Law.
Were you making a joke there?
No.
Traditions of War.
Sorry?
Traitors of War.
Oh, yeah. Traditions of War. I was more, as I've observed before, Oxford academic books all have colons in the title, and I was focusing on getting a colon in the right place and pausing at the right time. It's Traditions of War, Occupation, Resistance, and the Law. Rizwaan Sabir is an academic at Liverpool John Moores University, where he teaches in the Department of Criminology, and we're extremely grateful to him for coming. He has some personal experience of counter-terrorism legislation, as you all know, because when he was preparing for his PhD at the University of Nottingham, he downloaded a document from a US government website and found himself arrested under counter-terrorism legislation, specifically Section 41 of the Terrorism Act, for being concerned in the commission, preparation and instigation of terrorist acts. I think he was held for some days in custody. He was released, and in 2011 he received a large sum in compensation from the Chief Constable of Nottinghamshire, and a great deal of publicity around the world about that case and its implications for academic freedom in particular. So we're very honoured that you're here this evening. Thank you very much for coming. Imran Khan is a distinguished defence solicitor. Many of you will have read about him in the press or seen him on television. He's represented defendants in many very significant criminal cases and represented others in other very significant litigation, most famously the family of Stephen Lawrence in the various inquiries and inquests into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. He also represented the parents of Victoria Climby, and he represented the widow of Mohammed Sadiq Khan, the leader of the Seven Plot. I'm very grateful to Imran for coming. He has a wealth of experience, not just in the criminal law, but in the communities of London. David Anderson QC is a distinguished barrister practicing in EU law. Very topical. And
at the moment, not for long.
At the moment, yeah. Well, I hope it. Yeah, well, I've expressed an opinion, so I hope it continues to be a relevant discipline. And also human rights law. People involved in counter-terrorism policy and counter-terrorism law at the bar were absolutely delighted when David was appointed by the Home Secretary in 2011 as the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. He's proved himself since then to be a fearlessly independent and incisive analyst of counter-terrorism law, so much so that often what he says becomes legislation shortly afterwards. And when it's improved, as I'm sure it will be, the surveillance bill, which is about to come before Parliament, will owe a very great deal to his seminal report, A Question of Trust, which was published, I think, last year. I should also say that last year also saw his election by at the Halsbury Legal Awards as Legal Personality of the Year. So doubly grateful to David for making time in his busy celebrity schedule to be with us this evening. So I'm going to go on now to ask, I think, Imran first, then Rizwaan, and then finally David Anderson before we turn this discussion over to the audience. Imran.
Can I speak without the microphone? Can anybody hear it back? Thank you. Appreciate that. There's a couple of things I do when I speak at meetings. The first is to disabuse those of you who are expecting the cricketer. And there is a funny story, and lots of funny stories I have about being mistaken for him. I get the best taxis ever. I'm invited onto politics shows all the time, and the like. The one thing I don't get is get invited to cricket matches to commentate. The second thing is I have prepared something. It's often that you hear from particularly academics who can speak off the cuff about their topic. And the third thing is not quite knowing what the audience is going to be. And I suppose the fourth thing is I've been doing this for a long time, and therefore to try and put something in 20 minutes means it's incredibly difficult. And what might come out is a bit of something in what I've got to say, a bit of everything. And I hope that I can develop some of the ideas later on in the questions and answers. And I want to give you a taste of where I'm coming from. And I start by quoting one of my favourite columnists in The Guardian, as you might expect. I'm a Guardian reader. And it's Gary Young. And he wrote recently, forgive me where this starts, there is a point in this, which is when a dog bites a man, that's not news, because it happens so often. But if a man bites a dog, that is news. But over the past few years, I've wondered if there might not be an addendum to that adage, a qualifying footnote to what seems like the obvious, because there are things that happen with such regularity and predictability that journalists simply cease to recognise their news value. Not least if those things are least likely to happen to the people most likely to be journalists. Because much of what we have come to accept as commonplace has dulled our curiosity as to why so much of what is commonplace is unacceptable. Because given the prevailing and escalating inequalities and inequities, we simply do not occupy the same worlds we pretend to cover, even when those worlds are right on our doorstep. Because there is value in asking, why do dogs keep biting people? Who owns these dogs? And why do the same people keep getting bitten? Now, I look across this illustrious bench, and I don't consider myself to be necessarily illustrious, but we come from very different worlds, I suspect. And even if we don't come from different worlds, we occupy different views about the world. And I'll develop that a bit further. But what was Gary Young writing about? He was writing about numbers of black people killed by police officers in the US, and there being little news about them. He concluded this, and this was his conclusion. This is less the product of malign neglect than unconscious omissions born from the dead weight of power and privilege that make the poor and dark in America invisible. What I think he was talking about was a form of institutionalised racism, an issue which I know a little bit about from the Stephen Lawrence case. And what that report, if you've read about it, it sought to bring to the fore what was very clear in society, what was right at the heart of both the police and society at large over the last few decades. And what it came by way of recommendations, some 70 recommendations, its most important contribution, and again here it's not about reinventing the wheel as far as I'm concerned, it's about what lessons we've learned from that particular case, was what I call the mantra of recognition, acknowledgement, and the acceptance of the problem. In that case, of racism, of institutional racism. It was, in essence, a kind of truth commission, where official acknowledgement and acceptance was finally given to the evil of racism which had been perpetrated on black communities up and down the country. If you want to put it in a pithy way, racism became official. And the state and its institutions had to do something about it. So bearing that in mind, I wondered whether I might be able to suggest some of the challenges, some of the lessons that we've learned from that in terms of the challenges around the government's prevent strategy and counter-terrorism in general. So to go back to Gary Young's analogy, we need to know why dogs keep biting people and why the same people keep getting bitten. So bearing in mind recognition, acknowledgement and acceptance, well, the difficulty of course is how do we recognise, acknowledge and accept, particularly the problem that we're addressing, what is the problem? And whose point of view do we accept? And again, I like to quote other people, little bits that I found. In truth, somebody once said, is an enigmatic concept. It is simultaneously constrained and liberated by the possibility of the absolute, establishing precisely what really happened, or what really is at any given moment, is really uncomplicated, particularly in pluralist societies such as ours. And if you read a variety of newspapers, you'll have different perspectives on what happened, each apparently telling you the truth of what happened. And it's the establishment of the truth which underpins all that lawyers do, criminal processes, civil actions and the like. It's a search for the truth which underpins that process. The problem is, and this is the nub of what I'm about to say, the transition from stories to statements does not take place in a vacuum. And despite social democracies such as ours professing concepts of equality and liberty, the process of that transition from stories to statements is so steeped in institutional inequality that this transition from stories to statements produces a version of the truth which perpetuates the status quo, and which is, in my view, heavily weighed in favour of the state and its structures. Take the example of racism again. For years, the concept that racism infected the heart of society was difficult to accept. If you talk about state-sponsored racism in immigration legislation, very difficult for people to understand. It's only when you had this merger and inquiry and the rest of it that essentially racism became official part of our discourse. So what did this show? What does that show? Well, if it's not checked, social democracies such as ours often employ and do employ unreasonable force. They often act negligently. They often tolerate miscarriages of justices. And we may now ask whether they also treat its citizens of a Muslim faith differently. Do they do that? And is the discourse from stories to statements somehow weighed in favour of the state and different to a perception? So how did this happen? How did we get to the point where we have this situation arising? Well, we start with what I think is fairly obvious to everybody. We are living in difficult times, arising from the events of 9/11/7/7. There's almost universal agreement that things have changed. There's been immeasurable change in the UK. But one of the things, thank you, that we're now living in is globalization. It reigns supreme. There's a marked realignment of allegiances throughout the world. And all of this has taken place against a backdrop promulgated by every political party, whatever its shade, in government after government, of the idea of the common people, the nation, with a shared history and a proud culture to defend. An emotional attachment to the nation now provided legitimacy to engaging in conflict with those outside of the nation. Yet not all in this country share this view, for there's been an emergence of what is called identity politics. I know that that's emerged over the course of these seminars. And that has come to supply an anchor in the turbulent waters of globalization. And certain minority communities have rejected assimilation into the nation. And what they're developing is their own identity with a loyalty which is not necessarily tethered to the nation state, in this case the UK, or marked by geographical boundaries. You might call it the Muslim Ummah, the Muslims around the world. And US and British reaction to the events of 9/11/7/7 stand against a background refrain of a defence of the common culture, of Western civilization, or the democracies, who apparently have a shared history and proud values to defend. This is an entirely constructed notion. Because does our common Western heritage include Nazi history, black segregation in the US, Vietnam or British colonialism? And the thing is that when you go out and about and you have a particular faith and you have a particular colour of skin, you are taken into and supposed to have an emotional attachment to this new fake community designed to create a new sense of who is now outside or inside. And that's being fastened by the lashings of media mood music, which the last time I experienced that was in the death of Lady Diana. Yet far from all in the West, let alone Britain, subscribe to this view or indeed support any part of it. The new myth that we all belong to a shared community of the West excludes the experiences of millions and millions. And for some groups, critically, that exclusion has helped the emergence of what I've already indicated as identity politics. They've rejected assimilation into this freshly minced Western norm. They're developing their own identities with a loyalty, as I've said, not tethered to any inaccessible and unaccountable community called the West. And it's also lent content to widespread anti-Western feelings and protests. We've heard about them, I'm not going to go through them. We've seen what's happened in terms of the Arab Street, Saudi Arabia and its monarchy defending the holy sites, but somehow in hock to the US in terms of support. And these governments in the Middle East, which are more pro-US, have become part of the problem with the civil unrest and Islamic militancy. And now the globalized war on terrorism has sharpened all these chronic contradictions into an acute stage. And the thing is, the nature of globalization, that it factionalizes traditional leadership. It breaks down multi-ethnic religious states, unleashing ethnic wars. But critically, it's this. It's that what you then see is access to the resources of the rich nations, the US, the EU, and so on. They become the only base for survival, and there's a mad scramble of elites in the poorer world ensues. And these political elites seek any basis they can to mobilize a popular base or section of the armed forces in the countries they control, and they win the imprimatur of the World Bank or the IMF. And so economic and political exclusion creates a vacuum which is presently being filled with the politics of identity. And the thing is, with globalization, with modern technology, the tiniest village in Asia to the grand buildings of the big cities of the West are tied together in 1,000 different ways. And those links are now, with globalization, unbreakable. And the West produces a poverty and cheap labour of the East and South, and labour and resources of the East and South help prop up elites of the West. And that system of relationships is much clearer now than it's ever been, and produce a new and deadly contradiction. Because on the one hand, the extremes of poverty and wealth now face each other in the modern world. And the results of injustice, starvation, and war feed through the television screens of the West. And the opposite is also true. The hypocrisy, the violence, and the greed of the West are available to everyone else on the planet with eyes to see. And this contradiction becomes, and has become, acute and painfully obvious. And the leadership of many poor countries that seem to exist to their population only according to the whims of the West. We see it on an almost daily basis in countries that have been supported by the West and so on. For the child of the East or South, their birthright seems stolen at the behest of the West. The militant and dispossessed, with no sense of geographical or national boundary, sees opposition to the West in whatever form as justified, and even in the absence of any alternative explanation, a sacred duty. So, what we have, and what Silvio Berlusconi, I think, called a clash of civilizations, that is right, but it's without the plural. It is a clash within our one globalized, market-driven civilization. We are not fundamentally in a struggle between peace and terror, or of the fundamentalist Middle East against the liberal West, but in the last analysis of the rich against the poor, each side of this struggle looks through its end of the same telescope at the distorted image of the other. Compounding this conflict are not just geographical considerations, and cultural and political poverty of some of the new leaderships of the oppressed, but also religious segregation. Born, in this instance, and I come on to the topic at hand, an attempt at combating extremism, however defined. And by imposing a statutory duty on schools, prison, local authorities and NHS trusts to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism, the government has set the benchmark by which certain of our citizens are to be judged in society and sought to impose its own concept of identity. And back to the words of Gary Young, somewhere out there is the Muslim that the British government seeks. Like all religious people, the government is more likely to talk about Muslim women than to them, supports gay rights, racial equality, women's rights, tolerance and parliamentary democracy. He abhors the murder of innocent civilians without qualification unless they're in Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq. He wants to be treated as a regular British citizen, but not by the police, immigration or airport security. He wants the best for his children, and if that means unemployment, racism and bad schools, then so be it. He raises his daughters to be assertive they can wear whatever they want so long as it's not a headscarf. He believes in free speech and the right to cause offence, but understands that he has neither right to be offended nor to speak out. And whatever an extremist is, on any given day, he is not it. He regards himself as British first, foremost and forever. But whenever a bomb goes off, he will happily answer for Islam. Even as he defends Britain's right to bomb and invade, he will explain that Islam is a peaceful religion, always prepared to condemn other Muslims and supporting the government. He has credibility in his community, not because he represents its interests of government, but because he represents the government's interests to Muslims. He uses that credibility to preach restraint and good behaviour. Whatever a moderate is, on any given day, he is it. This is an entirely artificial construct, which is unrecognisable in Muslim communities. It completely ignores the politics of identity and fails to understand, either deliberately or negligently, the base for this lack of mandatory allegiance. Even the Quilliam Foundation, which is seen by some in the community as being part of the government's face, says this: the world's first counter-terrorism think tank set up to address the unique challenge of citizenship, identity and belonging in a globalised world. It then goes on to say, challenging extremism is the duty of all responsible members of society, not least because cultural insularity and extremism are the products of the failures of wider society to foster a shared sense of belonging and to advance liberal democratic values. And so far, generally so good. But then this: with Islamic extremism in particular, we believe a more self-critical approach must be adopted by Muslims. Westophobic ideological influence and social insularity needs to be challenged within Muslim communities by Muslims themselves, while simultaneously an active drive towards creating an inclusive civic identity must be pursued. And it's here in this last section where there needs to be greater understanding. Quilliam and government appear to be saying that the problem lies within our own communities. We need to be self-critical, self-censoring, and seek to assimilate and integrate into the society in which we have found ourselves with its values and its identity. And if we don't, the government will now do something about it. The prevent strategy, of course, the strategy is not laid out that way or articulated in such fashion, but that is what it is precisely, that's what precisely happened. Prevent is contrived to make the problem about us. And depending upon how we express our beliefs, we're either in or out with either one of us or one of them. The question, of course, is who is them? And in today's world, the discourse, whether with a deliberate intention or not, has contrived, in my view, without justification, to make the word Muslim synonymous with the word extremist. It's therefore unsurprising when we hear regular reports of attacks, physical and otherwise, on Muslims in Britain. And I'm not going to go through those today. These attacks are not just the creation of lone individuals. These are not your individual Nazi or National Front individual. It's part of a problem created and supported by the state and its institutions. We all know, I hope, that individuals and organisations do not operate in a vacuum. They're influenced and guided by the political culture around them. And it is the state, through its pronouncements, declarations, laws and edicts, that sets the tone, the tenor, the climate of how we treat each other in society. And such things have happened before. Using the lessons of the Lawrence Inquiry, prior to its publication, the debate, and if any of you were old enough, and I can see some of you will, you'll remember that debate. That debate had been about how to contain the problems that black people caused by their very presence. Post-Lawrence, first, white people were talking to other white people about the problems engendered by their racism. Now black people were being talked to rather than being talked about. So there's no doubt that the events of 9/11, 7/7 crystallised in many ways the ongoing experience of Muslims in the UK. And what I talk in terms of the statistics is there's now what might be termed institutionalised discrimination based upon religion. And it's perhaps inevitable that having set the agenda, the government having set the agenda from the top, those in society will follow and the media will reflect that move. I accept at the outset that the Muslim community is not a homogeneous group, but there has to be a national broad approach to its voice. I don't pretend to be one of those individuals. However, we must ensure that those who do or seek to do not mistake access with influence, assuming that co-option onto committees akin to a position of power. The fact is that few on the ground in the community see either government or its structures, or those clangos, or those individuals talking for them, rather than they are talking about them. And that's the discussion and the discourse that's taking place now. And those who do try and talk about their experience or about their perspective, for them, are drowned out or vilified. I have not written many articles recently in relation to terrorism, but when acting for individuals, there didn't used to be that many comment sections in newspapers, but the kind of quotes that you got and the comments that you got from people certainly indicated that if you were acting for somebody who was charged with terrorism, that you somehow sympathised and believed in what they said. And it's almost impossible now to have a meaningful discussion about the Muslim communities and what they're going through without somebody vilifying you or saying that you're a sympathiser. So how do we change? What must government do? Well, the first thing is to listen. My first engagement with those charged with committing acts of terrorism in the UK was a young lad called Sergeant Badat, who was sentenced to 13 years in prison for planning to blow up an aircraft with a bomb hidden in his shoe with Richard Reed. He didn't go ahead with the plot. He was a grade A grammar school student from Gloucester. And since then, Ken's already in the introduction kindly said that I've been involved in a number of cases. And they've included those who were convicted of the airline bombing. There's a reason why you have to take your shoes off at the airport and all the rest of it. Many, many individuals. And you spend many hours, very lonely hours, at a police station speaking to individuals who've been arrested for these sorts of offences. And you get to hear their stories. I don't want to breach any confidences, but each and every one is different, going up to those who travelled to Syria recently for terrorist training. Each has its own dynamics, but there's one constant thread, common thread: alienation and identity. Which brings me to my final, I know I've taken up more time than I'm supposed to, is what I call the reality spectrum. It's this, it was coined in the Lawrence Inquiry, coined by, in fact, the police officer who was one of the advisors to the Lawrence Inquiry. And what happened was that during the course of the inquiry, the second part of it, which came out to deal with issues of proposed recommendations, we would hear the police come along at 10 o'clock in the morning and describe their particular part of the world and say how wonderful it was and how things had changed since the Lawrence murder, and the police were no longer racist. And that in the afternoon you'd hear from local individuals. And on one occasion in Southall, we heard from the Chief Superintendent who said how wonderful his area was. Things were very different, there wasn't any racism. And at 2 o'clock, a middle-aged man came to give evidence, and he said, I heard Chief Superintendent blogs, and I thought I should move to that area immediately. And then realised he'd been living there for the last 30 years. It was an example of the reality spectrum. And what Macpherson did, what the inquiry did, he said that it's the responsibility of the state and its institutions to move across that spectrum. Now, it sounds rather cliched and rather airy-fairy, but it's very, very obvious and clear to me. I walk the streets of London, sometimes Oxford, and I have experienced racism Back in 93, 91 when I first started, if I complained about it, nobody had to take it seriously because they didn't understand or had lived my life. And until you do, you don't recognise what the problem is. Now, post-Lawrence, I don't have to say what that experience is, but something has to be done about it. What's happening now is that there are a group of individuals in our society who are alienated, who have an issue in relation to identity, who don't feel part of the state, and the state, it's the responsibility of the state to move in their direction, not the other way around. Until that happens, we are going to continue to have the problem that we have. And what Prevent has done is to institutionalise that process to such an extent that we are going to have even more alienation, more separation, no assimilation, no integration. It's got to be stopped. Forgive me, I know that was longer than expected. It was a bit bitty, I appreciate that. There's so much I want to say on this subject, which is so dear to me. I hope that I can answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Imran. Dr. Sabir.
Thank you. I'm not sure if everyone can hear me at the back. Yeah, okay, excellent. Some excellent points made by Imran, and I'm actually glad that he touched on issues of alienation and exclusion, and especially identity, because they are themes that I want to flesh out slightly in what I say today. I want to start with a kind of generic, general idea, and that is, in order to understand counterterrorism, let's start with the idea that how you diagnose a problem very much determines the response that you take. And I think that there is a consensus that a problem exists, whether it's individuals blowing up tubes and trains, whether it's individuals travelling abroad, and so on and so forth. How you diagnose the problem will determine the policy responses that the state implements and introduces in order to respond. Now I want to start with this macro understanding of how the state or the government perceive the threat of armed violence undertaken by political Islamic groups. Current policy essentially holds that the driving factor for political violence in today's day and age is religious ideology. Academic experts call this the new terrorism. What they say is that new terrorism is different from the violence undertaken by groups such as Mandela's ANC or ETA and their quest for a Basque homeland, or the Irish Republican Army, Tamil Tigers, and so on and so forth. The violence orchestrated and undertaken by groups such as Al-Qaeda and now ISIL constitutes a new form of terrorism, and the only way that we can respond to this new form of terrorism or political violence is to essentially introduce new measures. They base the idea that this is new terrorism on the idea by saying that groups like the IRA had a strict hierarchical structure. They used to ring in very courteously Scotland Yard and say we're going to bomb something. Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, have no structure. They're a leaderless movement. They're horizontally structured as opposed to vertical. There is no command and control. Individuals can undertake armed action as and when they choose. But most importantly, that their violence is driven not by politics, but by ideology and religion. Now, of course, there's three fundamental problems with perceiving and representing and dealing with armed groups since 9/11 in such a way. And I want to work through them. The first one is that if you perceive the opponent to be this ideologically motivated opponent, conflict becomes inevitable and conflict becomes unendable. And the reason is that if you as the government believe that the opposition or the opponent is evil, then you cannot negotiate. You cannot find a settlement. Evil always has to be fought. There can be no reconciliation, there can be no solution to this. And therefore you need to fight, and that creates and perpetuates feelings of insecurity and instability. The second one, that perceiving the opponent like this, is revisionism. And the reason is, if you pick up a history book and you have a look at the actions of the anarchists in the 1800s, you will find prime examples of violence being undertaken against civilians and institutions of the state, similar to those undertaken on the 7th of July and the failed attacks on 21/7 and subsequent plots and actual acts of violence. And thirdly, by claiming that this is an ideological movement, what the state essentially does, and for me this is the most important one, is it dehistoricizes and depoliticizes violence. Any classic textbook on terrorism and political violence will all tell you that terrorism is a political tactic used for the furthering of a political, religious, ideological, or racial purpose, as the legislation now says. So the idea that this new terrorism is using violence for the sake of violence, is using violence to cleanse the world of moral decadence, is completely incorrect and completely wrong. And it is essentially leading to incorrect policies and so on and so forth. That leads to a question. So is ideology completely irrelevant? And the simple answer to that is no. Ideology has a role to play, but any textbook, again, on ideology will clearly tell you that ideology and the power of ideology is to serve as a legitimator of political violence. It's never the cause of political violence. What causes political violence is politics. And by claiming that this enemy is new, by claiming that it has no historical precedence, by claiming that 9/11 was the start of history, you dehistoricize this attack. You take away the fact of how the US and Western powers and European powers have basically colonized the world through empire and essentially contributed, not created, but contributed to the conditions which have led to the levels of instability and violence that we are now seeing today. However, if we ignore all of what I've just said for the last few minutes, and we say, okay, that ideology is of course the cause of terrorism, we can see why universities have taken such a central position within today's counter-terrorism and counter-extremism agendas, policies and debates. In democratic societies, universities are meant to be institutions which allow and encourage, they nurture free thinking, critical thought and speech. The government, as a result, claims that these institutions have been hijacked. They have been hijacked by political Islamic ideologues and groups in order to brainwash and manipulate young students who are receptive to alternative ideologies and views. And what they do is they use a data set in the Prevent policy. And this data set seems extremely persuasive if you read it. And the data set says that 30+% of people who have gone on to commit acts of political violence, either at home or abroad, have basically gone to a university. Now that sounds absolutely fantastically persuasive. It's almost like saying that 30% of people who have gone on to commit acts of political violence shopped at Tesco's. To be entirely honest, the prices at Tesco's will drive anybody to political violence. Right? No, but I digress. What these statistics essentially do is they commit a terrible crime that statisticians warn you against, and they confuse correlation with causation. There is a correlation between individuals and violence and university, but this is not the cause of violence. And it's this precisely type of claim contained within the Prevent policy and current counterterrorism circles that is essentially leading to the development of policy that is having extremely problematic and extremely damaging impacts on the ground. And that's what I want to talk about next. Ken, in the introduction, mentioned my own case at the University of Nottingham. There have been other cases since at the University of Staffordshire involving a student, a postgraduate student, Mohammed Amir Farouk. There has been a case recently at the University of East Anglia, where a student whose identity and name is yet unknown was accessing the virtual learning environment on his university blackboard to access a website which contained extracts of ISIL's magazine, propaganda magazine, Davik. What's interesting is that the university spokesman said that this website actually aims to counter the ideology and propaganda put forward by political Islamic groups such as ISIL. So here is an individual on instruction from his lecturer accessing reading extracts for his course on the clash of fundamentalisms, essentially being picked out and scrutinized by special branch, right? You've got the case of the Staffordshire University student Mohammed Amir Farouk, who's reading a book by a distinguished professor in the US, John Horgan, called Terrorism Studies a Reader, and is essentially scrutinized by his university and members of staff and so on and so forth. In my own case at the University of Nottingham, I am imprisoned for 7 days in solitary confinement to be released without charge for being in possession of a document downloaded from an American government website, which you can of course completely evade all the security services and buy from W.H. Smith's for £20. How I wish I spent £20. Of course, the arrest and prevent practitioners on the ground who were involved in rolling out the policy at universities have said to me, Rizwaan, you must be extremely jubilant that we've now implemented prevent, because it now means that there won't be arrests like your own. And my response is firstly to say it is factually correct that there have been no anti-terrorism arrests on a British university campus which have been caused by a university tip-off, as it was in my case. Yes, it's correct. But I still don't necessarily support the PREVENT programme. In fact, I don't support the PREVENT programme at all. And the reason I don't support the PREVENT programme is as follows. When we are the subject of state intervention through the form of arrest, prosecution, or charge or detention and so on and so forth, you know that you are on the receiving end of some kind of coercive action. The power is being exercised in a visible and overt way. PREVENT, on the other hand, operates invisibly. PREVENT, as a policy, essentially operates without directly impacting any individual, but prompts them to discipline their behaviour. The effect, as a result, is the same as that of being arrested. When you are arrested, you become afraid, you become fearful, you start to discipline your actions and your thoughts. In fact, you discipline your thoughts to such an extent that it almost becomes a normal way of thinking for you. So constantly having to control and censor your thoughts and ideas. The effects of the PREVENT strategy are therefore disciplinary. Now, there's 3 points that I want to talk about in regards to disciplining of behaviour, actions and thought. If we understand Islamophobia to be not the spitting on women on a street in East London or in Manchester or in Birmingham, or the pulling off of a headscarf, or shouting abuse on a train or a bus towards Muslims, but if we understand Islamophobia to be a structural policy which seeks to discipline and prevent the agency of Muslims, or Muslims from articulating their identity through a Muslim gaze, what we basically find is that PREVENT serves as an Islamophobic policy which fuses classic racism and Orientalism. It combines and it bridges both of them in order to discipline individuals who want to articulate their identity through an Islamic gaze. Secondly, it is a policy that seeks not to encourage integration, but it is a policy that seeks to sideline and marginalize multiculturalism and integration, and instead promotes assimilation. Of course, this disciplining impact stands in complete opposition and conflict with civil and human rights such as free speech, expression and assembly, but more importantly, it leads to the spreading of fear, anxiety and the criminalization of legitimate, lawful and democratic ideas, actions and behaviors. And academic scholarship has shown that the PREVENT programme, as it stands today, is essentially leading to, the closing off and self-censorship of ideas, actions, and thought. Catherine Brown's research with Dania Saeed, who did a PhD here at Oxford, and Isa Mustafa, who did a number of interviews in excess of 30 throughout the East Midlands, and Dr. Abida Malik, again at the University of Nottingham. This is just a snippet of the academic scholarship. What they basically found was that female Muslim students, females especially, were resorting to what they termed quiet activism. And that basically meant that rather than involving themselves in legitimate dissent, lawful dissent, democratic dissent, participating in protests and demonstrations, or attending talks and congregations in order to organize counter-hegemonic activity or activity that challenges unfair and disproportionate state power, what they were essentially doing was closing off and going away into private spaces and not really involving themselves in some kind of actual dissent. And of course, it's understandable why now they are doing this. And the reason is because particular actions and ideas are being used to profile individuals, especially Muslims. In fact, my file at Thames House, the headquarters of MI5, was actually opened because I attended a pro-Palestinian demonstration at the University of Nottingham, in which I was falsely arrested for a breach of the peace and released within 30 minutes to prevent a breach of the peace. A breach of the peace never took place. But it was precisely that involvement in that demonstration on campus that led MI5 to know who I was and to open up a file on my name. So why is this significant? What is the relevance of this? In order to tie this down, I think this is the key point. Firstly, Prevent has always been claimed by the state and the government to be a policy that is about persuasion and about making friends and about softness. In fact, the fact that it's leading to fear and anxiety, it's causing self-censorship and disciplining of behavior without any active or proactive action by the state, shows that the policy, rather than being persuasive, is actually highly coercive in its impact, especially against Muslims, communities and individuals. And secondly, this might cause a bit of a stir, but Prevent, I believe, is creating the conditions that are actually conducive to terrorism. In other words, Prevent makes us less safer. Now that point needs explaining, and then I'll draw this up to an end. Terrorism, like I said, is a tactic used for furthering a political idea or objective. Terrorism as a tactic becomes more likely to be used in those environments which are repressive and closed, where people feel that the current political system will not accommodate their desire for social and political change, which makes them feel isolated, alienated, and disempowered. And one way of empowering yourself is to use violence. Violence, in this sense, to use Frantz Fanon's work, serves as a cathartic exercise. Hence the sociological saying that terrorism is the use of a very powerful weapon by the powerless. That's the first point as to how Prevent increases insecurity and creates an environment conducive to terrorism. It represses, and that leads to terrorism. Secondly, academic scholarship, again, by the noted terrorism expert Martha Crenshaw in the US, and Alan Kruger, who's an economist, has shown that terrorism is more likely, or the risk of terrorism increases in those societies which are authoritarian and repressive. And I quote Alan Kruger's quote here: "The suppression of civil liberties and political rights, including the freedom to assemble and democratic rights, all contribute to raising the likelihood that people will be ensnared in terrorism." So all this aside, I'm not going to do what every academic does, and that's critique and point fingers and then not offer some solutions or what we might think we should do. So there's a few things that I believe that need to happen in order to reduce the risk of political violence, because we can never stop political violence and terrorism. And I think that's a key point. What we can do is we can create the conditions which reduce the likelihood of political violence and terrorism being used. So I think that in any review that takes place, and I support David's work in calling for a review of the Prevent strategy, and if any new policy is devised, we need to do the following 4 things. We need to recognize, firstly, the political nature of this issue, rather than claiming it's ideologically motivated. And if anybody knows who Jonathan Powell is, I cite him because his work is very accessible. Jonathan Powell is somebody who was a seminal figure in negotiating the peace settlement between the Irish Republican Army and the British government. And he says that initially we always say that we won't talk to terrorists, but we always end up talking to terrorists. So this is a key point. By claiming that this is an irrational group, all we're doing is perpetuating the conflict, allowing insecurity to remain unaffected, and actually that's leading to more problems. So we need to use that one basic approach. We need to recognize that this is a political phenomenon that is confronting us rather than claiming it's religiously motivated and irrational and so on and so forth. Secondly, and again, it's so obvious, it's almost patronizing to say this, but we need to stop repressing individuals and lawful and legitimate and democratic debate, which increase the risk of terrorism and political violence. I'm not talking here about not allowing somebody to assemble in a British university or a college or a community centre. I'm talking here about the state of exceptionalism that has essentially been implemented since the attacks of 9/11, which allows individuals to go to prison for a very long time based not on their intent, but for example, the possession of a particular document. So it's precisely this state of exception that needs to be pulled back, and we need to go back to the common law system, which is more than effective in dealing with acts of political violence or plots. And if you have a look at all the main cases, Imran mentioned the transatlantic bomb plot. He can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but as far as I'm aware, most of the individuals, if not all of the individuals who were convicted for under legislation which dates to the 1800s.
Yeah.
So there we are. So we need to go back to that common law system. We have a more than appropriate system to use. I think thirdly, we're drawing to an end, that we should not deny Muslims the right to articulate their identities through an Islamic gaze. Not only does that undermine multiculturalism, but it essentially breeds exclusion and alienation. If somebody wants to take up the headscarf or to grow a beard, we should not be using that as being indicative that this individual will go on to become a future terrorist. We need to recognize that actually somebody is exercising their political agency, and that it's acceptable and completely okay to articulate your identity publicly in such a way. That is multiculturalism. Finally and fourthly, we need to acknowledge the historic role played by the UK in contributing to the insecurity and political violence. And why do we need to do that? Because it's only if we learn the lessons of the past that will we be in a position to devise a policy that stops us from committing the same mistakes over and over again. Without doing all or at least some of these things, I believe that the UK will continue to contribute to the conditions that generate insecurity and continue or allow the UK to remain less safe. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. David.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to start with Rizwan's second point, which is whether we need special laws at all to deal with terrorism or indeed with the sort of extremism that is said to be associated with terrorism. And there is certainly a case against special laws for this variety of crime, which goes something like this. The criminal law, as Rizwaan said, is designed for crimes of all kinds. Indeed, the only two terrorist murders we've had in Great Britain over the last 10 years have been rather more than that in Northern Ireland, ended up with the three perpetrators put on trial and convicted for murder. In any bidding war for special treatment, should we not be at least concerned about the 7 women killed every month by current and former partners, as we are by the victims of terrorism? And the more we treat terrorism as uniquely grave, the more we play into the hands of its perpetrators. Terrorism stands for everything that is extreme, dangerous, frightening, and secret. Qualities which render it glamorous, not just to supermarket workers in the West Midlands or diesel smugglers in Northern Ireland, but to all who associate with it, whether in government, law enforcement, industry, or dare I say, academia. fanning the flames with particular vigour are the media, who evoke fear to achieve attention, thus serving the interests of the terrorist who needs attention if he is to provoke fear. And it's by such a route that one arrives at the well-known words of Lord Hoffman in the Belmarsh detention case of 2004, snappily entitled A, the real threat to the life of the nation, in the sense of the people living in accordance with its traditional laws and political values, comes not from terrorism, but from laws such as these. Well, that is the case against a special terrorist code. But I would suggest that it is hard to deny there is something special about terrorism. In its classical form, it strikes not just at its immediate target, but at the heart of the values we stand for. Think of last year's attack on the satirical magazine and the attack on the Jewish supermarket in France, the free speech meeting in Copenhagen, the young concert goers of Paris, and on the extreme right-wing side, Lapshin's mosque bombing campaign in the West Midlands a couple of years earlier. Whether you call that political or, as I suggest, will sometimes be appropriate, ideological, that is surely part of what it's about. It's expressly aimed also at dividing societies. Why else would dissident Republicans be so keen to target the hotels in Catholic areas of Northern Ireland where the police service of Northern Ireland is conducting recruitment sessions, very common target for bombs. And it's aimed at destroying economies and regimes, for example by the attacks on holidaymakers in Tunisia or Sharm el-Sheikh. Then of course it could kill far greater numbers than it does. The majority of the 33,000 deaths from terrorism in 2014 were in the Middle East, and that's unlikely to change. But the low number of deaths from terrorism in the UK is attributable, I would suggest, not to the effectiveness of our insulation from that global threat, which is frankly poor, but rather to the high quality of our intelligence, the remarkable efforts of police and agencies, and their unusual skill in working together. Then, for better or worse, terrorism does frighten us. We might regret that fact, or try to blame it on the press, but it's true. In the aftermath of an atrocity, people curtail their normal activities and feel more suspicious. Terrorism promotes prejudice and damages community relations. And when someone does get through, of course, it's our freedoms that are liable to suffer. The shoe bomber that Imran mentioned of December 2001 and the liquid bomb plot of 2006 have left a legacy in terms of specific actions required of each of us when we pass through an airport. Although fortunately the underpants bomber of 2009 has not. How many atrocities are we away from having our bags screened before we get on the underground, as in Beijing, passing through an arch to get into a hotel, as in much of the Middle East, or having to book long-distance domestic travel in advance so that we can be checked out by the authorities before we get on a train or a ferry across the Irish Sea? The logic of such proposals is only too clearly understandable, but their deadening effects on our quality of life, I suggest, would be very great. And it's really for those reasons that we have had, over the last 16 years, and we've had them no longer, permanent anti-terrorism laws. That has also been the justification for laws against extremism, not just violent extremism, but since 2011, the non-violent variety as well. I'm referring to the reformulation of the PREVENT strategy in 2011. I think Rizwaan's incident was 2008, so it goes back to the original formulation of the PREVENT strategy, and I take it that by opposing the PREVENT strategy altogether, you would oppose its application to violent extremism as well as to non-violent extremism. But certainly it was extended in that way in 2011. Now I have to be a bit careful. I review counter-terrorism. I don't review counter-extremism or the PREVENT strategy. So I don't read anything secret on the subject of PREVENT, and I don't write reports on it as I do on the counter-terrorism laws. But one cannot help being conscious when one travels around the country as I do, that it is PREVENT that people want to talk about. I gave a short and I thought rather bland talk at the Muslim Council of Britain last November in which I said really not much more than that I thought the country was richer for its Muslims, that I had Muslim friends and colleagues, that the various things about Muslims that I admired, and I then spoke a bit about some of the counter-terrorism powers. Before I could even leave the podium, I had 25 cards pressed into my hand. I had invitations to visit from Tower Hamlets, Glasgow, Bradford, Birmingham, you name it. And I got a very strong sense of a lot of people who were simply not being consulted or listened to. So I've taken up a lot of those invitations. In very recent days and weeks, I've been travelling to, for example, Dewsbury, Bolton, Manchester, Leicester, talking to an awful lot of people, not all particularly political people, but quite a cross-section of people. And I thought it might be useful if, without trying to theorise about Prevent, I just tried to give you some sense for what I learned. And it's obviously only one person's reaction. I've spoken to hundreds of people, but there are no doubt many thousands of others who might have said different things. But I can give you at least a snapshot of where I have felt, at least, concerns to be. And I'll start with counter-terrorism, and then I'll go on to prevent and countering extremism. Surprisingly, perhaps in a way, I believe that the counter-terrorism laws are the less problematic of those two areas. The vast majority of Muslims have no sympathy whatever for terrorism, and indeed recognise that they are the principal victims of terrorism worldwide. They support strong measures to deal with the threat of terrorism. So it's very rare in my conversations with British Muslims to hear objections to the executive orders which permit, for example, the assets of suspected terrorists to be frozen and their movements to be restricted, or indeed the extended powers of arrest and detention that exist under the Terrorism Act. It helps, of course, that these measures are imposed on very small numbers of people, certainly the executive orders. Secondly, I hear nothing about the precursor offences, as they're called, controversial as some of them were when they went through Parliament in the year or so immediately after the 7/7 attacks of 2005. So we've bent the criminal law in acknowledgement of the particular nature of terrorism to catch acts that fall short of the normal conspiracy, attempt or incitement. So for example, you could be convicted of acts preparatory to terrorism, or of indirect encouragement of terrorism, or of disseminating terrorist material. There are relatively few prosecutions, particularly of the second and third of those offences, and the prosecutions that there are do not appear to me to have left their mark on the popular psyche. Even the very broad power in the Home Secretary to strip people of their British citizenship when she considers it conducive to the public good does not seem to be as controversial as a proposal is for a similar power in France, and as the recent Canadian law was, which is just in the process of being appealed by the Trudeau government. And contrary to what I would have expected, and I'm more than willing to be corrected and told that I haven't talked to enough people, the new ban on bringing a foreign spouse into the country unless one's income is above a certain level, to which a legal challenge was heard recently in the Supreme Court, has never been raised with me. Indeed, when I've queried this with my hosts, I've been told that it might be secretly rather popular with the younger generation, which would prefer to marry someone settled in their country than an unknown person from the family's country of origin. More problematic for some are the lesser powers, which impact on a larger number of people, in particular the no suspicion stop and search power under the Terrorism Act, and the powers to question and detain travellers that may be exercised by ports police, also under the Terrorism Act. But the first of those powers was repealed in 2011 by an unusual but happy alliance between the European Court of Human Rights and the Home Secretary. This was a power that was used more than 250,000 times in 2009. Hasn't been used for 5 years. And the port powers, already reduced in scope by 2 acts of Parliament, are used less than half as often as they were 5 years ago. They're used in a more targeted and effective manner. And they are increasingly used for safeguarding purposes on outbound journeys, looking for unaccompanied teenagers going to Turkey and so on. So one still hears complaints, but at a lesser volume. The other point to make is that, and I've alluded to this already, many of these counter-terrorism powers, and again, people simply don't realise this, have been scaled down over the last 5 years. And that was certainly the direction of travel after the coalition government came into office. Macdonald had a good deal to do with that, and it's only in very recent times that we've seen the tide perhaps beginning to turn in that respect. So, if I could safely recommend that the existing powers be further scaled down, I would do so. Indeed, I do have some outstanding recommendations not yet acted on, and I'll keep all the laws under review. But it was very clear to me that the counter-terrorism laws were not the principal grievance. The principal grievance seemed to be about countering extremism. Now, before one condemns PREVENT in a blanket manner, there were elements of PREVENT that certainly nobody suggested to me were wrong. For example, the work that's done to notify Google of horrible YouTube videos posted by ISIS of a propaganda nature, with the result of which most of them are taken down, or the sending of theatre groups into schools to produce workshops on diversity with the help of the pupils, those sorts of elements which fall within the PREVENT programme, but which one doesn't hear criticism of. What I hear criticism on, and I don't mix in the rarefied circles of the universities, but it's really three things. The first is the PREVENT duty in schools. The second is the proposal to inspect madrasas. And the third, more faintly, but I suspect that's because it's further on the horizon, is the proposed counter-extremism bill. And I'd like to say just a little bit about those, with a particular emphasis on PREVENT in schools. The statutory duty came in last summer on all sorts of public officers, including teachers, doctors, to be vigilant for people being drawn into terrorism and to notify the authorities if they become suspicious that this is happening. I find PREVENT in schools difficult because I understand, firstly, that signs of being drawn into terrorism probably is one of the dangers that a reasonable teacher might keep half an eye open for. I'll give the example of my namesake, Ibrahim Anderson, a chap with a bushy red beard who was sentenced a few weeks ago for recruiting for ISIS. He was actually shot by a couple of fellow Muslims who attended his stall on Oxford Street and didn't like the sort of things he was saying. Well, during his trial it came out that he'd been photographing his 8-year-old and 6-year-old sons in front of the black flag, carrying swords and pointing to heaven. And I would have thought that if that sort of thing would have come to the attention of a teacher, one would hope that, as in other safeguarding type cases, the teacher might think of doing something about it. I'm also conscious that not all these stories have been verified. Every single Muslim group I've spoken to for the last couple of months has told me the story of the terrorist house, which became front page news in everywhere from India to Australia. This was the poor 8-year-old boy who wrote in his homework, "I live in a terrorist house." And the stupid police, can you imagine how stupid they are, went round to the house, gave his parents a hard time, looked in their laptop, and all the rest of it. A beguiling and irresistible story. Of course, on this occasion, it was only a half-truth. The police eventually got around to contacting the Lancashire Evening Telegraph 2 days later, and therefore rather too late for anybody's purposes. But they did produce a photograph of the boy's homework, a single page, and it did indeed say we live in a terrorist house. The previous paragraph said, "I don't like it when my uncle beats me." And the police explained that this was an absolutely standard, and one would hope, absolutely correct safeguarding intervention. Whether that excuses everything they did, I don't know. But it just shows there are two sides to these stories, and I'm very reluctant to take any of them at face value, although when you talk to people who appear not to have any political agenda, and when you see the sheer volume of these stories, you do have to sit up and listen. And then the third point I'd make is that, who knows, maybe we're looking here partly at teething troubles. The duty's been enforced for less than a year, and the training materials are only just coming out. Ken tells me, in fact, that at Wadham you haven't yet got your procedures in place for the PREVENT duty in universities. And one has to be mindful of the possibility teachers perhaps are not naturally fascists, and all the ones I know read The Guardian. Is this a question of inadequate training and teething troubles? But aspects of this subject came up time and time again in my meetings from a variety of teachers, parents and pupils. And I came across 3 frequent concerns, which I take to be genuine because of the people that communicated them to me. First, teachers did not feel able, as they previously had, to discuss terrorism-related subjects. So the opportunity to develop critical thinking skills by talking about when violence can be justified, the meaning of terrorism, the comparison between ISIS and other terrorist groups, the most effective form of resistance to an unjust government, simply weren't happening. I heard this from a teacher in Bolton who used to have these discussions in the college where she taught with 16 to 19-year-olds. doesn't dare have them anymore in case she's reported. And I would suggest that when subjects such as that are not talked about, the vulnerability of children to online propaganda is, if anything, increased. Secondly, parents feel inhibited about discussing these matters, even in the home. This is something I hadn't understood until I talked to parents about it. Their fear is that the child might repeat a fragment of the conversation and get the family into trouble. So a second aspect and a second closing down of, I would suggest, a very necessary avenue for free discussion. And I did thirdly speak to a Muslim teacher, and again I haven't heard both sides of this, but she considered that she'd been the subject of an unjustified referral to Prevent by a fellow teacher. I don't think the fellow teacher liked her very much, but the allegation was that she'd said she was going to spend the summer in Syria. Her version of events was that she'd said she was going to a fundraising dinner for Syria. But one can understand the fear of this teacher, the only Muslim teacher in a pretty well-to-do white school, when that sort of thing happened. So it seems to me that this has actually got to the stage where, for whatever reason, distrust and suspicion has been endemic, very much as Rizwaan was saying. And if the Prevent duty, or at least this aspect of it, is to be persisted in at all, the suspicion that currently surrounds it has to be dissipated. Now one could be radical and say, let's get rid of the whole thing. My suggestions so far have been much more conservative. I've said that, first of all, the operation of the policy needs to be much more transparent. For example, why can't the training materials be released publicly? And why can't a reasoned explanation be given for the balance between the attention given to Islamist extreme right wing and other forms of terrorism? And I've also, as Rizwaan mentioned, pointed to the advisability of independent review, either of the Prevent strategy as a whole or specifically of the Prevent duty in schools. I think that the office that I currently hold has done a good job in the past in allaying certain suspicions about the operation of the counter-terrorism law, simply because you take a member of the public off the street, give them access to the secrets, require them to report to Parliament, and expect them to do so in an unvarnished way because they don't expect any favours from the government. I think we've got to the stage where, at the very least, this is what the Prevent policy requires. Of course, these remedies may not be enough. A number of people I spoke to thought that teachers needed no specific statutory duty, that they were already practising safeguarding and building resilience, as you would expect good teachers to do, and that extremism should not be singled out from all the other dangers that adolescents are prey to, from gangs to drug addiction and so on. Very briefly, madrasa inspection hasn't come in yet, but it seemed to cause dismay among Muslim communities. I visited some madrasas. They think of them as a place where people go after usually primary school or very early years of secondary school to fill in worksheets, to learn the Quran, and the notion that these would become proper subjects for inspection strikes people as an assault on the fundamentals of their religion, and nothing to do with extremism and terrorism at all. In the same category is the widespread view that David Cameron wants to ban the wearing of the full-face veil. I don't think one can find that in any of his speeches, even hinted at, but it is some indication of how beleaguered people are feeling, that they feel they can believe that. And then the third thing is the countering extremism bill proposed in the Queen's speech last year, but not heard of much since. I heard less about this simply because I think it is less on people's radar, but I find my own reaction to it much more straightforward than in relation to the Prevent duty in schools. The idea of placing people who engage in extremist activity under, quotes, extremist disruption orders, close quotes, any breach of which could result in their imprisonment, seems to me an unpromising one for at least three reasons. First of all, the difficulties in defining extremist activity. Secondly, the reliance on civil orders to bypass the protections of a jury trial. And thirdly, the likelihood that they would prove counterproductive in terms of police relations with the community, and even perhaps, as Rizwaan suggests, in terms of radicalisation. In a report I wrote last September, I identified 15 questions about this proposed bill which MPs might like to have in mind as they debate it. The Joint Committee on Human Rights repeated those questions in a letter to the Home Secretary. So far, neither of us has had an answer. So perhaps when this, or where this proposed bill is concerned, there has been a rethink. I don't know. If that turns out to be the case, and I have no more idea of the position than you have, you may already have worked out that no tears on that subject will be shed by me. Thank you.